the compassion has to be accompanied by the truth and follow the truth. And insisting on the truth is a compassionate response.
I want to go back to what I just mentioned about apologies because you've got some really good information in your book about what what an apology is versus what a concession is. And I think this is so important for people who are listening and watching because we hear people come to us and say, "Well, I guess they apologize," but it's like it didn't mean anything or it didn't really help or it didn't and people can feel like that's their fault. When in reality, I think you touched on why it's a concession. It wasn't actually a genuine apology. So would you mind breaking that down for people?
Yeah, and I think at any point, during this process of bringing truth into the light, however that happens, that there's got to be an emphasis on what's true and a communication of truth, speaking the truth in love. And if somebody is trying to hold on to their image, hold on to the control of the narrative, and they're doing that in deceptive ways, offering all these different denials and excuses and justifications, what I've seen happen sadly is that that might progress until that person finally reaches a point of having to acknowledge, yes, this did happen, having to acknowledge some kind of responsibility, but they're not doing that from a place of sincerity and out of a desire to make amends and repair what's been broken, but they're doing that as sort of a last gasp effort to retain their legitimacy in the eyes of others, to retain the power that they have. So the way that I've seen it expressed sometimes is leadership, an abusive person saying, "All right, well, if if all people want is an apology, then we'll apologize. I'll apologize, and then maybe everyone will be satisfied and go away." That isn't that never leads to an authentic apology. It leads to what I call a concession. It's it's people conceding, kind of waving a white flag of surrender, and hoping that that'll just diffuse everything. And the main difference is, I think, one is in the intent, but also as you can't always gauge intent, but you can look at what's being communicated. I think the main difference in what's communicated is whether or not you see attached to the quote unquote apology all the attempts to promote themselves, all the attempts to defend themselves, all the excuses and justifications. So usually in a concession, you might have a very short admission of responsibility, like a "I'm sorry," and then you get some of the self promotion, but this is what I've done all my life to show that this is not who I am. This is not what I'm like. Or you might get all these excuses, but you just need to understand how difficult life has been for me. Or you might get an attack, some kind of language that then turns things around and attacks the people who raise concerns. So it's not an apology. It's something else it's being communicated. But because the person throws in the words "I'm sorry," they might be able to say it's an apology, and people might accept that. The other difference in communication that I've seen is when you have these conditions that are applied, usually introduced by that two-letter word "if" that sadly shows up in too many apologies, especially institutional apologies, where what I've seen happen is leadership get to the point where, okay, they can't deny that, yes, people have been harmed and we need to own our responsibility. And so they get up and they make an apology, but somebody has convinced them, maybe a lawyer, that if you actually confess, then you might open yourselves up to liability. Somebody might sue you. So they say something like, if anyone was harmed, um, if we have been too harsh, or if we have mistreated people, if people have been abused. And that, anytime I see that, what I see is a concession. And because it doesn't actually name the wrongs clearly, the injuries that have been caused by that wrong, but it's leaving the possibility, the door open, that maybe this did or didn't happen, or maybe we're guilty of this, maybe we're not. But it's so sly and it's so subtle that it can appear as, okay, this is they've said they're sorry, but you've got these little conditions that are introduced, these little two-letter words like if, or that little word but, and something else is being communicated other than an authentic apology.
You said something about this is in your book. You said something along the lines of compassion. It was in relation to compassion and truth. I think compassion without truth is deception. And what you're speaking to right now could be just flat out deception because it's just flat out deception. But when we talk about compassion without truth being deception, I really love this line. I think it connects with some of what you're sharing right now and what we may or may not see from someone as we're trying to reconcile. Would you mind explaining what you meant by this?
But I think one of the sad outcomes of deception, especially when you get to these stages where, let's say, somebody who's been exposed, a leader, maybe they're in a position of trust and authority, they present their narrative to people, and maybe they seem to be apologetic, but you can't actually find the truth anywhere. Nothing's really named, nothing's really identified. But it's at that point that sadly some people might be pressured into, maybe guilted into responding with compassion. And that's part of the deception, is that person who's controlling the narrative might get people to divert their attention away from those who have been victimized, those who who ought to be the object of our compassion, and instead they promote their own suffering through this. And sometimes that's offered in the context of a quote unquote apology, and then people respond or are pressured into then extending compassion to that person, but the truth hasn't been established. So that's what I mean. That if that the compassion has to be accompanied by the truth, and follow the truth, and insisting on the truth is a compassionate response. I think of um, something Alice Walker, who's best known, I believe, for writing the book The Color Purple, said in one of her interviews, or in one of her writings. She told the story of breaking something as a child, and then her dad coming to her and asking her, did you break this? And wondering as a child how her dad is going to respond if she tells him the truth. But she decides she's going to tell him the truth. She tells him the truth, and he responds with such compassion and in a way that delighted in her truth telling. And she says, that one of the lessons from that was that in telling the truth, you free yourself from the prison of untruth. And I think that's a powerful picture and way of putting it. Is that, if somebody's walking a path like this, and they're Uh, there have been accusations, and leadership has failed people. Leadership has mistreated people, and there's a moment now to tell the truth. The compassionate response, I think, is to invite people to do that, even if they've tried to offer an apology, but they still haven't named the truth. To invite them to do that and insist on that as that is a compassionate response.
I can think of an example from my own story that I think what you're sharing applies to very well. My in my story, my primary story is in like, being raised in a pseudo-Christian cult. The fact that mine and my siblings' abusive leader was our father, our literal biological father, really played into the compassion piece so strongly that even though he's been gone for over 15 years now, he died quite some time ago. Some are still completely unable or unwilling to consider what's true. They're unwilling to consider the truth. And so, with me being out about the truth, speaking to the issue and sharing from my story, attempts have been made to assign the guilt and shame to me for acknowledging the truth of what's happened. But in reality, it's the truth. And the truth doesn't come without love for someone. It's just what's true. And the truth doesn't come without compassion for someone and their story of how they got to be where they were. It's the truth, though. And so I see that interplay where some people they want to give all the compassion, but they totally overlook the truth because if they do look at the truth, the compassion's going to have to be tempered by that truth because there's going to be some accountability that now has to come into play as well. And that's hard. And so I want to acknowledge that for everyone as well. Like there's a freedom. I resonate with what you said. I think you said Alice shared. There is this freedom that comes from it because we're not trying to hold things together that don't actually go together anymore. Like we're not trying to maintain this reality that we know is untrue, even if it's subconscious. And yet we have this freedom that comes, but it also can mix with some really real grief and that's a journey that, I would say at the same time we get to go on because when we lean into it and we turn towards it, we do get to really heal and do get to really rebuild. And we're doing it on something that is, again, it's based in truth. That's something I'm so thankful for in my own story.
I appreciate you sharing some of that. Yeah, it is very difficult to face the truth and to tell the truth and to speak it and to say it out loud, and I think that needs to be kept in mind, and then when you're if you're in a position of inviting people into that same kind of process, it needs to be just that, an invitation and giving people a sense of, okay, yeah, this is going to be hard, and you may need support, and it may be accompanied with grief and accountability, but on the other side of that is freedom and inviting people into that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so worth it.